The morning sun poured its golden light over the small downtown cafe, a modest place tucked between a laundromat and an old bookstore, and inside, a young black waiter named Daniel moved swiftly between the tables, balancing trays of steaming coffee, buttered croissants, and plates of eggs with practiced grace, his apron dusted with flour from a careless brush near the counter, his smile genuine but quiet. For Daniel was not the kind of man who spoke much about himself, he carried his silence like a shield, polite but distant, always respectful, always professional, and though many customers saw only a hard-working waiter who never failed to deliver their orders with kindness, none of them knew the weight he carried inside, the memories he had buried beneath layers of humility and service, memories that clawed at him during the late nights when the cafe closed and the world was silent. That morning, however, something unusual was about to break through the rhythm of his ordinary life, something that would change him forever, and it began when the doorbell above the entrance chimed softly and a woman rolled in, her wheelchair creaking slightly against the old tiled floor, her eyes scanning the room with both uncertainty and determination, as though she had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind before finally arriving here. She was in her mid-30s, her brown hair tied loosely back, her clothes simple but neat, and though she carried herself with a quiet dignity, there was something about her that drew every pair of eyes in the cafe, a fragile strength that seemed to radiate from her presence, and Daniel, ever attentive, walked quickly to her side, greeting her with his warm but restrained smile, guiding her to a comfortable spot by the window where the sunlight spilled gently across her shoulders, asking softly if she needed any assistance, to which she replied with a grateful nod and a quiet thank you, her voice trembling just enough for Daniel to notice, though he said nothing, only handed her the menu and waited patiently as she glanced over it with distracted eyes, as though the food was the least important thing on her mind. When she finally ordered just a cup of tea and a small slice of bread, Daniel knew immediately that she had not come for the food. People who came here to eat ordered heartily, but she had come for something else entirely, and though curiosity tugged at him, he kept his manners intact and returned to the kitchen, only to glance at her from time to time as she sat, hands folded tightly over something in her lap, as though protecting it from the world. When he finally returned with her tea, setting the steaming cup carefully before her, the woman looked up at him with eyes so intense that for a moment Daniel felt as though she could see through him, past the uniform, past the rehearsed smile, straight into the heart of the man he had tried to hide from the world, and then, without warning, she pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, its edges yellowed and creased with age, sliding it across the table with trembling fingers until it rested beneath his hand, and Daniel, startled, looked down to see his own name printed in bold letters across the top of the article, his breath catching in his throat, his hand freezing in place as memories he had fought to bury came rushing back with painful clarity. The article was from years ago, a story that had once made headlines before vanishing into silence, a story about a boy who had once been a rising star, a gifted pianist whose music had touched hearts and promised greatness, until tragedy struck, an accident, a fire, a family lost, dreams shattered, a life forever changed, and Daniel, who had been that boy, had disappeared into anonymity, working odd jobs, drifting through life, until finally ending up here in this little cafe where no one knew who he really was. Except this woman, who sat before him now, her hands trembling as she whispered, "I've been looking for you for years," and Daniel's heart thundered in his chest, his mind reeling, for he had no idea who she was, why she had searched for him, or what this moment meant, but he knew one thing with certainty: his life, carefully kept in shadows, was about to be pulled back into the light, and nothing would ever be the same again. Daniel stood frozen, the newspaper clipping still beneath his trembling fingers, his pulse roaring in his ears as if the cafe around him had melted into silence, the hum of voices fading, the clink of cutlery and the hiss of the espresso machine all drowned out by the weight of this unexpected moment, and as he finally lifted his eyes to meet the woman's, he saw not pity but fierce conviction, the kind of look someone wore when they knew a truth too important to ignore, and she leaned forward. Her voice barely above a whisper yet sharp enough to pierce him to the core, "You saved my life once, and I've never forgotten you," leaving Daniel stunned, confused, as fragments of memories long buried began to claw their way back. He had been younger then, still reeling from the fire that had taken his parents, his promising career in music shattered, his nights spent wandering in grief and despair, yet there had been a day when he stumbled across a terrible accident in the pouring rain, a young girl in a crushed car, her legs pinned, her cries lost in the storm, and though broken himself, Daniel had crawled through glass and metal, pulling her out, carrying her against his chest until help arrived, and then disappearing. Before anyone could ask his name, retreating into the shadows as he always did, too consumed by his own pain to stay. Now, as the woman in the wheelchair held his gaze, tears welling in her eyes, he realized with a jolt that she was that girl, grown now, carrying the scars of that night, and the clipping she had handed him was not just about his music but about the quiet heroism no one had ever known, for somehow she had pieced the puzzle together, tracked him down, and found him here, in this tiny cafe. I searched every hospital record, every old concert program, every name that matched, she said, her voice trembling with emotion, because I needed to tell you, you didn't just save me, you gave me a reason to live when I thought my life was over. And Daniel, usually so composed, felt tears sting his own eyes, his hands gripping the table as the walls he had built for years began to crumble. The cafe had grown quieter, customers stealing glances at the emotional scene unfolding, but Daniel didn't care. His world had shrunk to the woman before him, who now reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather notebook, placing it between them with reverence, explaining that after the accident, when she was told she might never walk again, she had clung to the memory of the boy who saved her, the boy whose hands had once made pianos sing, and she had started writing letters to him in this very notebook, every year, on the anniversary of that night, never knowing if he would ever read them, never knowing if he was even alive, but writing anyway because it gave her hope, because she believed that somewhere out there he was still breathing, still carrying a spark of the light she had seen in his eyes that night. Daniel touched the notebook with shaking fingers, flipping through pages filled with handwriting, words of gratitude, despair, encouragement, prayers, dreams, and suddenly he felt as though the years of silence and loneliness had been bridged by this unseen thread, this connection he had never known existed, and something deep within him stirred, a part of himself he thought had died with his family, the dreamer, the artist, the boy who once believed in music and miracles. Why show me this now? He asked, his voice hoarse, and the woman smiled softly through her tears, replying, because it's time you stopped hiding. The world still needs your song, and with those words she pushed a small envelope across the table, inside of which was not just an invitation but a challenge, a flyer for a charity gala seeking performers to raise funds for children's rehabilitation, a cause close to her heart, and she told him that she had arranged for him to play, believing with all her soul that he still had music in him, that the boy she once idolized and the man who once saved her could inspire others again. Daniel's first instinct was to refuse. Fear and doubt rushed to his throat, old wounds screaming that he was not enough, that too much time had passed, that the world had moved on. But as he looked at her, a woman who had lost the use of her legs but not her spirit, who had built a life of purpose out of pain, who had spent years searching just to remind him of who he was, he realized that saying no would not only betray himself but also her faith, and so, after a long silence that seemed to stretch across time itself, Daniel nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek, whispering, "I'll do it." And in that moment it was as though the cafe itself exhaled, as though the universe had been waiting for him to reclaim his destiny. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Dusting off an old piano in the back of the cafe, his fingers stiff at first, trembling as they touched the keys, but slowly, painfully, the music returned, not as flawless as before but deeper, richer, carrying the weight of years lived, of grief and hope entwined. And when the night of the gala arrived, Daniel walked onto the stage in a modest suit, the lights hot against his skin, the audience a blur of faces, but in the front row sat the woman in the wheelchair, her eyes shining with pride. Her hands folded over the same notebook she had given him, and as Daniel began to play, the first notes shaky, then steady, then soaring, the room fell silent, every soul suspended in the spell of a man who had once been lost but was now found, pouring his pain, his love, his redemption into every chord, until by the final note the audience erupted into applause, tears glistening on strangers' faces, and Daniel bowed not just to them but to her, to the girl he had saved, who in turn had saved him. And as the curtain fell, his heart lifted with a new purpose. he would never again hide in the shadows.